Kia ora koutou, ko Jaz Morris tōku Whenua. And as Sunny mentioned, here to talk to you today about braided river weeds. And I think it's fair to say we all have a bit of a bias in this room, many of us at least, towards birds. And the talk today is really, even if you're not quite with me on the plant side of things, because I'm a botanist, just think fewer weeds, more birds, and hopefully you'll be able to follow along. So as far as an overview of the talk today, to talk to you about the purpose of braided river weed control, as I mentioned, birds, to talk about risks in terms of old weeds that have been here for yonks, new ones that might be arriving in New Zealand or in the region, or just that have been sitting there but are now exploding, and what that means in the context of often 20-year regional pest management plans, which is our statutory tool for combating them. I want to talk about the benefits of catchment-scale management and how we decide the priorities for that management in terms of a multi-tenure approach, how we go about it, and who does it. Finally, just to try and keep this talk largely photos and so on, I'm going to share some horror stories, but also some comebacks, and hopefully bring you along, because this is quite a broad topic and it might be familiar territory to many of you, but that's kind of the point. This isn't an issue that goes away. This is a thing that needs multi-year, multi-decade ongoing effort. And so you might be thinking, come on guys, aren't we done throwing herbicide at gorse and riverbeds now? The answer is no, and hopefully you'll see why. So here is, primarily what it's all about, right? And I don't know if anyone heard tōrea as the bird on Morning Report this morning. I thought that was pretty auspicious. I don't know if Sunny cooked that up. Well done, if so. Also, just to acknowledge our terrestrial invertebrates as well, to say nothing of freshwater macroinvertebrates and fish. And to highlight as well that many of these species are really cryptic in terms of this little minute grasshopper or these ribel eggs, thanks to the Ashley Rakahuri Landcare group for that photo. But these are the poster children really for why we do weed control. And in case you haven't been to one of these conferences before or aren't so familiar with the braided river weed issue, broadly speaking, weeds hide predators, predators eat birds. If you don't have weeds, the birds stand a much better chance, and the knowledge of that goes back many decades, and some of the people in this room were foundational in that early understanding. As I mentioned, I am a botanist, and I also want to basically give a shout out to some of our braided river plants. A lot of these are really small. They look kind of dead. They might not even have a common name. This one doesn't really have a proper common name, but some botanists call it sticks. This is a green vegetable sheep. That's kind of a cool name. You've also got some scabweed, some leafless pohewe. This one doesn't have a common name other than being one of many things that we just call dwarf broom. Riverbed forget-me-not. Yeah, I mean, these are beautiful, supremely adapted species. And just because they're tiny and often hidden and often don't have sexy names, we really ignore them, I think, a lot of the time when we think about why we're protecting braided rivers. And just like the birds, these guys get crowded out and excluded completely when weeds take over. So to share what a good braided river looks like in an upper catchment in the Rakaia at Toitū Point, beautiful sequence from active riverbed to some stabilizing bars and some older floodplains and some mature floodplains. This is where we get that mosaic of habitat, not only for plants, but for birds, fish, invertebrates, lizards, and so on. And that sequence really relies on the mobility of the braid plane and it being able to turn over and those braids to shift during peak flows and in particular big floods. And weeds essentially act as an anchor and they lock that whole system down. And then you end up in a situation like this, where you've got intensive management, lots of herbicide spraying, bulldozing, and the rest of it, just to try and maintain an open fairway for flood conveyance. And not every lower river looks as bad as this, and it's fair to say that a lot of work goes into trying to maintain some of the open habitats in this river, but it's really at the point where there are none of those native diminutive plant species carrying on in any kind of functioning way in this ecosystem. We're a long way gone. Here's, again, maybe a better picture in the upper Rakitata. And the point isn't that you can go from that previous slide back to this through weed control. The point of weed control isn't just to kill weeds. If you wanted to just kill weeds for the sake of a kill count, you'd go back here and you just unleash herbicide on it. It's actually to take out one by one the really sparse weeds that will flip this system over time if you let them. Now, how does this play out and who's doing this and why? Well, a lot of this work that happens in our braided rivers is driven by regional pest management plans. These have a 10 to 20 year lifetime. They are a function of regional councils resulting from the Biosecurity Act and some other regulation. And there's a democratic process that goes in. They've got multiple objectives, including management of pasture weeds, so things that affect people's livelihoods, and also biodiversity weeds, which often kind of play second fiddle. And what that leads to is often an ambiguous status for some of our key weed species. Douglas fir is mentioned, I think, once in the Canterbury RPMP, but it doesn't actually have an official status requiring you to control it, because obviously that would then conflict with plantation forestry. Russell lupin's an even odder one. It's there as a control priority in the plan, but only if it's wild. So you're still allowed to grow it in your paddocks for fodder and so on. Within certain limits, they can't be near a river, but we have this kind of ambiguous status. And really, I think that muddies the water on what people think of these species. Whilst a lot of the rules in RPMPs are binding on landowners, there's very little enforcement. For example, did you know that you have to control all wild Russell lupin within 200 metres of a braided river? That's probably going to be quite alarming to any of you who own land within 200 metres of a braided river, because there may well be Russell lupin on it, and you are, in some ways committing an offence under the RPMP. And there's very little enforcement of that. Not all of the species in the plan need to actually be controlled in any way, and there's no quick way when a new thing comes along to add that into the RPMP and to require people to control it. So, dare I say it, we might need a fast-track process for recognising new weeds and recognising that we need to get them into a statutory kind of management approach. I will come back to this, though, because this is a little bit vexed in some ways. But I do just want to ask a bit of a question. I think by the time I get to the end of the slide, you might guess what the question is, or the answer is, sorry. But what do all these weeds have in common? Some grey willow, upper havelock, some spindle tree in the upper Rakaia, Himalayan honeysuckle in the Dart, purple willow in the Matthias, California poppy in the upper Waimakariri, pampas grass, false spirea, this is a weird one, I'll come back to this too, and crack willow in the hydrowaters, beautiful wetland sequence at the Matthias-Rakaia confluence. What all of these species have in common? Well, in their respective regions, there's not a single mention of those species in the local RPMP, although they are clearly biodiversity weeds with ample evidence over long periods of time to demonstrate the consequences that they can have for that habitat. I mentioned that RPMPs are a little bit sluggish, and maybe we need this sort of fast-track process. We do have new things coming into New Zealand all the time, and we also have new issues that seem to be exploding from old species, like purple willow being found way up the Matthias. Here is what basically looks like a carpet of it in the Ashley Rakahuri, thanks to Nick for the photo. And then we have new things like great willow herb in the Otakaro Avon River corridor, here, not here in Christchurch, just down the road in Christchurch. So clearly we need to be able to manage new incursions. But we also need to think, whenever we find one of these new horror shows, are they actually controllable? And does a response detract from more achievable objectives? Because dare I say it, and I'm talking a little bit outside my expertise as a botanist, but when I look at things like golden clam and didymo, which spread through the most simple methods, didymo's a unicellular species that, a damp bit of duck is going to move it, basically. We've thrown millions of dollars at these incursions, and we have to ask ourselves, if we look at the simple ecology of these species, were we ever going to take them on once they got here? And so then that can be a bit defeatist. It's like, okay, well, it's here. Are we not even going to try and deal with it? And so the way we think about this, as you may have seen, is the idea of an invasion curve. When something is just starting out on its spread, that's the most cost-effective time to control it. And that makes perfect sense. But sometimes, and perhaps with golden clam, because eDNA says it's been here for a while, we don't actually know where we are on the invasion curve. By the time we've seen it, we might actually be some way along it, and we might already be in the territory where the response is actually going to be really costly. So we do need to think about, is anything achievable? Should we just pack up and go home? And hopefully for the rest of the talk, I'm going to show you some examples of success and why we should absolutely carry on. And the example I'm going to give is weed management at a catchment scale. This happens in a number of our braided rivers in Canterbury, also in Otago and Marlborough. And a lot of this work is guided by weed management strategies developed for each upper catchment. Those strategies are based on surveys, mapping and control out in the field. And the intention of them is to guide single project managers working across agencies and across land tenures. They also, in the absence of one of those cross-agency programs, they enable local action by local groups. They can say, all right, here's the list of things to get on with. And they also allow for a 5 to 10 year check-in and reassessment. Who's doing this? To acknowledge the who and the where, and in particular the involvement of stakeholders without whom none of this would be possible, in particular land care groups, river care groups, runanga, landowners and occupiers, and the likes of fish and game NGOs as well, who all have a common goal of healthy braided river catchments. And weed control is not just the only thing that's going on. Many of these rivers have broad restoration objectives, such as Ko te whakahamanu te Rakitata awa, the Rakitata revival strategy down in the Rakitata River. So to give an example of what one of the survey maps that goes into these weed management strategies ends up looking like, this is from the 2023-2024 survey of the Upper Rakitata, and essentially the entire catchment is surveyed, remote weeds are controlled, and this goes into a big picture of, okay, what are we going to do where? What are our key species? We're not just thinking gorse, broom, RPMP things, we're thinking much broader than that. It's like, hang on, there's a whole bunch of spindle tree, or there's this marram grass over here, or what have you. So this is what the map looks like. It might have more or less weeds in it, depending on where you are. And here's what a point on that map might actually mean in practice. So we're talking about huge areas. For example, the area managed under the Rakitata Braided River Flagship Project for weeds is 150,000 hectares of catchment. That's just the upper catchment above the gorge. That compares to the size of Stewart Island. The Rakaia catchment is bigger. So we're talking about big areas, small weeds, big landscapes. You know, it's clear that we're always going to miss things and always going to need to be following up and always doing things over multiple years. So the benefits of this approach, though, are you work to a plan, you tackle the highest priorities first rather than, you know, the highest priority on my patch that I'm responsible for. You work beyond the RPMP because these strategies are prepared with ecological and biodiversity flavour rather than RPMP compliance in itself. You need to involve stakeholders frequently, and if you don't, you'll find yourself locked out of access. You'll find yourself not getting those hot tips of, hey, I saw some Spanish heath in this random bit of the Rakitata. We're going in there tomorrow, we'll get it. And, you know, that sort of stuff is invaluable. One person or group is responsible. That means that they're in charge of the data management, coordination, accountability, and so on. With multiple funding streams for these projects, if one agency or partner loses funding for a particular year, the overall resilience is still there. And efficiencies of working across an entire area. There is a huge cost to get to some of these remote places, whether it be by multi-days on foot or four-wheel drive or by helicopter. None of this is cheap. And remember Stewart Island when you think about that. What does land tenure look like in practice? This is a pretty simple example. We've got some Lynn's Riverbed, we've got some Dock Hillside, and we've got some Russell Lupin, and it doesn't care which side of the border it's on. Pretty important here and pretty self-evident that if you want to get on top of the Russell Lupin up in the Forbes, this is in the upper Havelock, you need to work across land tenure because otherwise this guy gets out of control. How do we do it? There's some misconceptions here too. I think most people think apocalypse now and bring in the choppers and just go to town with herbicide. And look, it's true that in the past there has been by-kill from indiscriminate spray methods. But just like we used to use 30 kilos a hectare of 1080 and now we're down to 2, techniques are improving. The understanding of what we're doing over time gets better. And a really good contractor who knows the land can absolutely nail it, like this precision kill of broom. Shout out to Simon Worthmuller at Rakaia Heli. The beech trees around it untouched, and this is in a really confined gorge. He's done this spot spraying from the helicopter. So we're trying to absolutely minimize the amount of herbicide you're needing to put into the environment and minimize the by-kill there. And I hope you'll agree this is an impressive example. By helicopter, you can see here there are some heli survey lines in the light grey, but the real work for sparse and low stature weeds is ground control, so that the darker grey lines. And this is really intensive stuff in terms of time and cost. And we're talking about the Forbes River way, way up the headwaters. Just think Stewart Island, and you'll understand again why this is ongoing, why this takes decades to get on top of. But you also need to audit your contractors and ideally employ them over multiple seasons if they're good, so that they can get to know the area. Make sure that they're skilled up in identifying species, making sure that their health and safety practices are good because of where they're going, all those sorts of things. Okay, take a bit of a pause with a few minutes to go. We've talked about weed strategies and the work that goes in behind implementing them. I'm now just going to show some horror stories of some of the weed infestations that we've come across out in the Braided Rivers when we've been preparing these sorts of strategies in the last few years, and show you some examples of places where the work has happened over many years and some of the results we're getting afterwards. Te Awa Whakatipu Dark River, partly a braided river, in the upper mid reaches and then in the lower reaches. Looks pretty good here, right? Well, essentially a few years ago, somewhere down the bottom of the slide, there was a landslide dam about 10, 15 years ago, which drowned a lot of forest, and you can kind of see at the edges. So all is not well in this awa. We've got a couple of things here. We've got this slip that this was the one that created the landslide dam. This randomly has this thing called Sorberia tomentosa, sometimes called false sprayer. It's kind of a relative of rowan, and it's a specialist of shingle habitats. Here is Te Koraka slipstream, a Tōpuni, a very sacred, important site. This stream has a bunch of this rubbish in it, and it's really hard to kill. It's one of those awful suckering things that gets into the shingle, gets into the grey shrublands. Who's ever heard of it? Other than Amy Clark at Dock and Glenorchy, who's been battling it with a knapsack spray the last few years. But, just a bizarre sort of thing that, even a botanist is unlikely to be able to ID just purely from, not having come across it. It's like, what do I even do with this? I haven't seen this before, and I hadn't seen it before until I was down there. I mentioned the drowned forest. What that's done is created all of this amazing silty substrate for this big infestation of grey willow around that, basically all in here. All the little grey bits, lighter greeny bits in there. So this is thousands of trees across hectares in a really tricky spot to control because of the dead beech trees. This is going to be heinous to get on top of. But, as a result of some of the survey work, we now know that it's there, and we can think about how on earth we're going to get on top of it. Another horror story to show you some gorse in the head of the Havelock River on a four-wheel drive track almost near St Winifred's Hut. So if you're on foot, there's 2 or 3 days of solid walking from the road end. Way up there, so the main divide is kind of, only a couple of k's away. That's the main divide right there. And you've got gorse getting on, probably on a four-wheel drive, because it's on a four-wheel drive track, all the way up that river. It's only if you are out there surveying that you pick these things up. The better side of things, the why do we do this? Comebacks. I'm going to let this picture say 1,000 words, and then I'm going to add some more words, which is to say that over the last couple of decades, the Potts, which is a tributary of the Rakitata, has had an awful lot of work to get on top of this broom infestation, and we are now seeing the results. Fantastic outcome that I hope will make you all understand this work is worthwhile. This work needs to carry on. If there are skeptics in the audience going, oh, well, hang on, the floods reworked a whole lot of this island, and that's probably got rid of the broom as well. Well, it's like, yeah, that's the point. We're allowing these braided rivers to function naturally, and to have the floods mobilize the braids and so on, rather than if you'd let this go and it just becomes a big stable island. Now, this is in the mid-Rakitata River, just above the gorge. What mid-catchment looks like this? This is outstanding, bare gravels, sparse, mat daisy, scabweed, and tussocks and things. Fantastic. So I really want to just leave it there, leave you with these conclusions. Weed control is not just about killing plants. It's about saving birds and saving our native plants too. RPMP's not the perfect tool. Cross-agency programs, however, can be quite effective when you work alongside stakeholders across land tenure and beyond just the RPMP requirements. As I've said a few times, it's not just about killing weeds. It's about protecting habitats and landscapes and doing it the right way. And when new pests arrive, reassess your priorities, of course, but don't take your eye off the prize. Yes, we've been killing broom and gorse for decades, but we should carry on killing broom and gorse. The reason is that hard, consistent work pays dividends. So some acknowledgements. The question was, how do weeds get around? Think of them probably, for simplicity, in 3 broad camps. There's the ones that have delicious berries that birds move around. So that's your rowans and spindle trees and those kinds of things, sweetbriar rose as well. There are your ones that are wind spread. So that includes some of the willows that we have, grey willow in particular. But increasingly it seems purple willow, which was planted out by lots of regional councils. They would do it as, oh, we're going to plant all females over here and that's going to be sterile and it's not going to spread because it's only females. But then over here it's all males and eventually the two meet. And then you have seed blowing miles on the wind. False tamarisk is another one in that category, really light seeds that can travel upriver. Whilst we are helped probably by the prevailing northwest wind with our Canterbury braided rivers, we do occasionally have easterlies and things that will take things back up the catchment. And then the third category is stuff with really hard, heavy, durable seeds. So your lupins, your gorse, your broom, they will often explode out of the seed pod and get thrown a few meters. That gets them around a little bit, but the real thing is when those heavy seeds get into the water, they get transported downriver, they're durable, they can cope with that, they can resprout wherever they're deposited, or they can end up in a bit of mud and a bit of tread on someone's four-wheel drive, or on someone's gumboot, and then they get out of their four-wheel drive. And that's how for the likes of that gorse, probably one assumes, happened to be on a four-wheel drive track miles and miles up the Havelock River. Yeah, no, absolutely. And having now done a few of these surveys and a few of these catchments over the last few years, where do you find weeds on four-wheel drive tracks around huts? There are some differences for some species, things like grey willow. You always seem to find them on the real, you just find them anywhere. Yeah, a lot of your gorse and broom and a lot of, we're also dealing with legacy as well of settlement in a lot of these high country rivers. Some of these huts and four-wheel drive tracks, they were mustering huts only a few decades ago. Some things have been deliberately planted, gooseberries, Antarctic beech, you name it, for firewood or whatever it might be. So absolutely, humans are number one, in particular, I think, for new species. But then it depends on the species itself. Once it's in there, what's moving that around. Well, that's my opinion anyway. The best single thing to do, I would suggest, is to put them on iNaturalist. There are agencies who are monitoring whenever a particular species pops up on iNaturalist in their particular rohi. Whenever we prepare these sorts of survey strategies and things like that, we're absolutely searching iNaturalist for a particular area. I think it's fair to say that there's no solid single point of contact for weeds in New Zealand, and that's probably a nationwide issue. I could say tell the regional council, I could say tell DOC, I could say tell Linz, who might own the riverbed, or it might be the project manager of the weed control in that particular area, but that's always going to chop and change a little bit. So, and I think for a single answer, iNaturalist would be great. I'm going back to university days, which is getting a few years ago now, and at that time, it may have moved on, but I understand that the signal that we see in the altitudinal shifts and things of plants is still lagging a little bit, the climate signal. But I would say that we probably don't fully understand well enough what a given plant community and a given riverbed looks like now versus what it looked like 10 years ago or 50 years ago or 100 years ago to really be able to make confident comparisons. If I was wrong about the point about altitude movement, come and talk to me, but that's going back a few years, like I say. The key thing I see with climate change in these braided rivers is the magnitude of floods. And if you remember, I talked to you about the mosaic of habitat. Essentially, if a big flood comes along and eats what was previously a stable old bit of floodplain, some bit of floodplain will set up elsewhere, and that will be spared from floods for the next few years until things move back over again or what have you. If you don't have a native seed bank and functioning native ecosystems on those stable floodplains and islands and bars, then what recolonizes your braided river after it's been reset by a flood? That's another real imperative for this weed control, I would say, and making sure that we protect those habitats that are still pristine to be the seed sources. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Weed control is our restoration and habitat protection mahi in these rivers. It's not planting. It's about taking out the weeds and allowing those natives to flourish and to spread themselves around. Yeah, you're right. It's not like lowland forest where you let it go to gorse and then that can turn to forest naturally if you've got a seed source. This is a special, globally uncommon habitat that is best protected by allowing its natural processes to occur through weed removal as one of the key measures. I'm not aware of detailed research into the seed bank longevity for Russell lupin, but I can, I'll talk about tree lupin in just a moment. There's seed bank in terms of how long it lasts, but there's also how far it can move. So I came back to this slide to show you this plant because that's come from up here. So, multiple kilometers, presumably through, unless this is a new introduction that's come up from, four-wheel drive or something, the more likely scenario is it's come downriver. So these are extremely durable seeds. Tree lupin, I know of some research out at Toitū where essentially some folks got an enormous kind of sieve contraption and dug down into the sand dunes, which is a bit different to river gravels, obviously, but it's the only work I can think of that's relevant. They dug down and were able to date, this is decades old sand, and they're sieving out lupin seeds from that decades old sand, and they're getting them to germinate. Tree lupin, in fact, in that same study, a person doing that research from, this was happened to me in my honours year, they got some seeds from a herbarium specimen from Toitū that had been, I think, put in an oven to dry out, treated with mercuric chloride, which is what you do, and she managed to get about 20% of those seeds. Oh, sorry, they were about 60 years old as well. She managed to get about 20% of them or something like that to germinate. So these are absolutely extremely durable, well-adapted seeds for surviving in braided rivers. I don't know exactly how many decades, but I would be strongly guessing that it's decades.